So good morning, everyone. Let me start by just introducing the work that we do at IOM and at the Global Migration Data Analysis Center in Berlin. We were established, if you can show this first slide, please. We were established back in 2015. And this had nothing to do with the so-called migration crisis in Europe. This was an initiative by our former Director General, Ambassador Swing, who felt that IOM needed to do more in the field of migration data. And what we have seen in recent years is that he took a decision well before the rest of the UN. Only last year, the UN Secretary General launched for the first time a UN-wide data strategy. And in that strategy, he encouraged all UN agencies to give much greater priority to collecting, analyzing, sharing, and using migration data to inform migration policies and practices. And we are, I think, part of this. The establishment of our center in Berlin was an early first initiative in this direction. And what I'm going to do today is present some of the information that we collect through one of our flagship initiatives, which is called the Global Migration Data Portal. It's an initiative which is specifically mentioned, incidentally, in the Global Compact on Migration under Objective 1. And as you probably all know, Objective 1 of the Global Compact highlights the importance of improving data on migration around the world. And what we have done since December, since the onset of the pandemic, is to create a special section of this Global Migration Data Portal where we have tried to collate in one place all the latest statistics and information relating to COVID-19 and its impact on mobility flows and on migrants. Before I get started, let me also say that today I'm going to focus primarily on international migration and international migrants. This is not to say that IDPs are not important, but I don't have time to go fully into that subject today. But clearly there has been an increase in the numbers of internally displaced persons in different parts of the world during the pandemic, not least in places like Afghanistan. So let me begin by talking about what I'm going to do in this presentation is, first of all, talk about the impact on mobility around the world, both inflows, outflows, and also irregular migratory flows. And then in the second part of the presentation, I'm going to look at some of the data that we have on the impact of COVID-19 on migrants. So first slide, please. So one of the things that some of my colleagues do in IOM through our displacement tracking matrix is they collect data on a regular basis using a network of informants around the world on global travel restrictions. And they've been doing this throughout the pandemic. And this information clearly shows, I think, how in many parts of the world, it has become increasingly difficult to move without meeting a series of particular requirements. At the beginning of the pandemic, mobility almost ceased in many parts of the world. It has picked up since then. One of the problems associated with these travel restrictions is that many migrants around the world became stranded in the place in which they were located at the point of the pandemic and were unable to return home. And this particular problem is something that IOM has focused on over the last year or so. And last year, we calculated that something like 3 million people around the world could be classified as stranded migrants. Next slide, please. As you saw in the film, a number of organizations have been monitoring the flows of migrants into some of the key destination countries. And much of the best information comes from reports produced by the OECD, but also a new report which is produced by OECD, IOM, ILO, and UNHCR, which focuses on migration to the G20 countries. And in that report, the agencies highlight the fact that there has been a dramatic fall in the numbers of work permits and residence permits issued to migrants. The average figure in the first half of 2020 was something like 46%, but for individual countries, the figure was often much, much higher. As we noted also in the quiz, this has also, all these restrictions have made it much more difficult for people to seek asylum. And we've seen a dramatic fall as well in asylum applications. Now, this slide also highlights one thing which is perhaps not so obvious, and that is that this dramatic fall in global migration flows and this historic fall could have potentially longer-term implications for demographic change in a number of countries. And here we have highlighted two examples, one from Australia and one from Germany, to illustrate the point that the fall in migration means also that the population is not growing in countries like Germany for the first time in a decade. And we see a similar trend in Australia. So one of the questions for the future is, how is this, what will be the long-term impact of this decline in mobility for population growth and population change in a number of countries around the world? Next slide, please. Despite the fact that there has been there was a significant recorded fall in legal migration flows, the picture with respect to irregular migration is much more mixed. Frontex at the beginning of the pandemic certainly recorded a dramatic fall in the numbers of people attempting to cross borders irregularly. But you only have to pick up the newspapers. And if you think about countries near to Slovakia and what's going on in Belarus and Lithuania today, you know that irregular migration has not stopped completely. And what we have done in IOM through our regular reporting on the situation in the Mediterranean and also in the Atlantic, we have been able to show that along certain routes, we've actually seen an increase in irregular migration. And I think this slide makes it much clearer for you. You can see that over 2,000 people migrants and refugees lost their lives in the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean during the pandemic. And worldwide, IOM, through its Missing Migrants project, recorded the deaths of nearly 4,000 migrants. Just a word on the Missing Migrants project. This is an initiative started by IOM in 2014 to try to pull together the information about the number of migrant deaths and disappearances around the world from a global perspective. Now, at the time, most countries were not collecting national statistics on this topic, but every country was being encouraged to promote safe migration. And as you know, one of the key aims of the Global Compact on Migration, but also the Sustainable Development Goals, is to promote safe, orderly, regular migration. So the question which arises then is, how do we measure unsafe migration, especially if countries are not collecting national statistics on unsafe migration? So we created the Global Missing Migrants Project, and that project is a project which is based in Berlin, and we have regional correspondents in different parts of the world, in Central America, in Asia, in parts of Africa, who regularly collect data from a range of different sources on the number of migrant deaths and disappearances. Next slide, please. Besides a drop in the numbers of people coming into Europe and other key destination countries, the other major trend that we have seen during the global pandemic has been an increase in return migration, as many migrants lost their jobs or found it more difficult to live in certain places where they were working. Of particular note is the very large number of Indians who returned from many of the Gulf countries in which they were working, but also huge numbers of Afghans returned from Iran and Pakistan. And as you know, now are maybe struggling to make ends meet in Afghanistan, which faces a huge number of development and humanitarian problems. This is also something to keep in mind when thinking about the impact of the pandemic on flows of people around the world. It's much more difficult often for us to obtain data on return migration because countries tend not to record this as well as they do record immigration. But we have noted significant return flows during the pandemic. Next slide, please. So now I want to focus on the impact of the pandemic, not so much on flows of people, but on the migrants themselves and how the pandemic has affected them. And of course, it is very difficult to obtain recent information on all of this. But one of the things which is clearly apparent is that, and this was known before the pandemic, is that migrants were clearly what might be called essential workers, however that is defined in different countries. They have and continue to have a key role in the health sector, in the social care sector. Not only are large numbers of doctors and nurses in many countries not only are they migrants, but in the social care sector, in the sector where people are looking after elderly and disabled, often in their homes, there are also very high numbers of migrants. And migrants are also dominate in some of the other sectors of the economy, such as services, agriculture, etc. You can see there in the slide. So on the one hand, during the pandemic, there was an appreciation by the general public that migrants were performing essential tasks, but at the same time, migrants, because they were in these sorts of jobs, were often especially exposed to risk. And, for example, in the health and care sector, or they were in parts of the economy that were especially exposed to the downturn. And therefore, or they were in jobs which could not be done at home very easily. Working in the service sector meant that you couldn't really easily, you can't drive a bus from home, for example. So that also exposed them. So next slide, please. So let's have a look at the impact of all this. Now, in the migration field, it's often very difficult to disaggregate health information by somebody's migratory status. So we don't really have very good data on the numbers of migrants who were infected by COVID-19 or who died by COVID-19. But there is more evidence emerging, some of it from the OECD, some from individual studies, which suggests that there's clear evidence from a number of countries, including several Scandinavian countries and certain cities in Canada, in Portugal, where studies have been carried out, which show that migrants had a higher risk of contracting COVID-19. There's also some limited data based on reworking of mortality statistics in certain countries in Europe. I think France is one of those, which shows us that in some cases, migrants were also more likely to die of COVID-19. Now, the picture is not universal or complete. There are some variations. In the case of Italy, apparently, the statistics don't point in that direction, and we're not quite clear why that's the case, how far that is a reflection of the data or the reality. But anyway, one would assume that migrants during this pandemic, because of the risks that they face, both in terms of the types of jobs they were doing, the fact that many migrants were living in overcrowded housing or in reception centers where they could not socially distance, the fact that migrants often don't have the same access to health and social care as non-migrants, all of these factors meant that in certain parts of the world, migrants were often exposed to more risk than non-migrants. Next slide, please. And here are some figures which from other parts of the world outside of Europe, from Singapore and from Saudi Arabia, which confirm what I have just underlined. And here the figures refer specifically to low-skilled migrant workers who are disproportionately affected by COVID-19. Next slide, please. So we come back to the question that was posed to you in the quiz. And this is the question of, are countries including migrants in their national vaccination and deployment plans? And this is something that IOM has been working on with the WHO for several months to try and collect information on countries' national vaccination and deployment plans. And what the results of this survey show is that, broadly speaking, about half of the countries included migrants and refugees in their national vaccination and deployment plans, but only about a third of the countries included those who might be described as undocumented or migrants in an irregular situation. And this is potentially problematic because if migrants are more exposed to risk, then they're potentially more likely to spread that risk. Therefore, nobody is safe until everybody is safe. And that's why migrants need to be fully included in the national vaccination deployment plans. And a number of countries have tried to take initiatives and launch campaigns to target this group. Another trend that we have seen emerging, and this is something that was highlighted as a problem by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres last year, is the concern that migrants will be blamed for the pandemic, that we will see a rise in anti-migrant sentiment and xenophobia because, let's say, migrants from Asia or other parts of the world are seen to be the source of the virus or spreading the virus. And so there isn't that much data and evidence on this, but some of the evidence that we were able to compile suggests that, unfortunately, there has been an increase in anti-migrant sentiment and in the number of incidents where you see migrants being attacked and blamed for the pandemic. And this is something that IOM has been trying to work against through public information campaigns to try and promote a much more positive image of migrants, highlighting, for example, the fact that they've been making invaluable contributions as essential workers, for example, during the pandemic. Next slide, please. So finally, there were many concerns about how the pandemic would impact on migration and development. Because, as you all know, remittances are now often much more important to a developing country than overseas aid. Billions of dollars are sent overseas. Even in the case of Afghanistan, last year, Afghan migrants from around the world remitted to Afghanistan through official channels alone nearly $1 billion. It was around $800 million, which was equivalent to over 4% of Afghanistan's GDP. And that was just through formal channels. We believe that many migrants, Afghans in Iran, Pakistan, and beyond, send home money through informal channels. So these flows are extremely important. And there were many fears that as migrants were forced to return home, as they became stranded, or as because they lost their jobs, that there would be a collapse in remittances and a sharp fall in the amount of money that migrants send back home. Now, as we mentioned right at the beginning of this presentation, that did not happen. We're still trying to understand fully why that did not happen. But in the case of Afghanistan, which is in the news today, what is particularly worrying is the fact that some of the money transfer companies have already said that they will stop their operations. And so this is a vital source of income to many families in the country, which is going to potentially dry up. And although there's a lot of focus currently on the potential number of Afghans who might be coming to Europe, we have to think about the wider dimensions of the pandemic and the fact that in the case of Afghanistan, one of the major problems is the fact that so many people have been displaced internally within the country. Another problem is that most of those who have been displaced outside of the country are residing in Pakistan and Iran, and only just under 10% of all Afghans currently live in Europe. And most of those who live in Europe live in one country, which is Germany, which hosts just over 250,000 or more Afghan migrants today. So if we look at the big picture, mobility has not ceased during the global pandemic. We've seen some very important changes in the nature of the flows. We've seen a sharp fall in regular migration to key destination countries. I haven't had time to talk about flows such as student flows and labor migration flows. So that we've seen enormous changes there. We've seen an increase in return migration, but we've seen a continuation of irregular migration. We've seen a fall in asylum seeking and refugee resettlement, but we see emerging migration pressures due to an increase in forced displacement. The big question for the future is going to be, what will the world look like in the next few years? How will we see global mobility reshaped in the coming years? What will international migration look like, given that we're still struggling to address the pandemic around the world? Many countries are still imposing very strict travel restrictions. You have seen in the news lately restrictions, for example, in countries such as Australia and Asia and different parts of the world. So the big question that many people are debating today is, what is the future of global migration beyond this pandemic? And how can we get countries to work together to develop a global response so that countries try to manage all of this through international cooperation by developing common policies in this area? And that isn't happening at the moment because we've seen, with the exception of the European Union, where there has been an attempt to impose a more common approach, really very separate national initiatives. And that makes it very difficult to facilitate global mobility. So I think I've come to the end of my time this morning. I'm not sure whether or not the organizers are now going to allow any time for any questions, but thank you very much for your attention. If we just turn to the very last slide, if you want to learn more about the things that I have said, please consult the Migration Data Portal and our pages dealing with COVID-19. Thank you very much.